Now, this brings us to the third talk, and this time it's by Dr. Xavier Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez's presentation is entitled, "People Don't Talk About Filipinos Here, Examining the Institutional Invisibility of Filipino-American Students." Dr. Xavier Hernandez is the Diversity and Inclusion Program Officer for the University of California, Irvine College of Health Sciences. In addition to being an alumnus of UCI, he received his BA in Criminology, Law and Society from UCI. He also holds an MA in Asian American Studies from San Francisco State University and a PhD in Educational Policy Studies from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Prior to rejoining the ranks at UCI, he served as the director of the Asian American and Asian Resource and Cultural Center at Purdue University. He also has experience as an instructor in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Illinois and the Department of Asian American Studies at Purdue, respectively. His academic publications include articles in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, and the co-authored monograph, Asian Americans in Higher Education, Charting New Realities. Here is Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning to those of you who are joining us from around the world. I'd also be remiss, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Santo Domingo. I'd also be remiss, given our audience, if I did not mention that as an undergraduate in 2006, I studied abroad at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, with the College of Arts and Letters. So that institution holds a very near and dear place in my heart. The title of this presentation is "People Don't Talk About Filipinos Here." It is part of a larger study that I did for my PhD dissertation that compares Filipino student experiences in the United States West Coast and the Midwest. Given the folks who are participating on this panel, I saw fit to sort of isolate the California-based data, which is at the University of California, Irvine, to sort of understand and dig deeper into these discussions about what it means to be a minority student or what it means to be a Filipino-American student in an institution of higher education. So I'll start with an overview about the University of California, Irvine. This is the undergraduate population for fall 2019. As you see there, the demographics, most notably 17,000 Asian undergraduates. This includes domestic and international students, followed by 7,800 Hispanic or Latinx students, 5,300 white, 1,000 black, and so on. The University of California, Irvine is designated as both an APAMS and a HSI. So APAMS meaning Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institution, and HSI meaning Hispanic Serving Institution. More specifically, what is unique to the University of California system is that Asian students are able to check off their ethnic group. There are 17 different ethnic groups made available through data collection. So here are the 5 most populous Asian ethnic groups at the University of California, Irvine. So this is underneath the 17,000 Asian students. We have 8,000 Chinese, 3,100 Vietnamese, and 2,100 Filipino-American students in fall 2019 at UC Irvine. This is how it breaks down across the UC system. As you can see, the UCI in the last, not only the last 5 years, but I have research data going back to, I believe, 1996 or 1997 that illustrates that UCI has had the highest Filipino-American student population for, a quarter century. I know that we talk about the UC system as this, sort of monolithic entity, but if you've gone to high school in California, you understand that there are different niches and identities from the different campuses. And I'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation, but this is how Filipino-American students are distributed amongst the UC system. UC San Francisco, which was mentioned earlier, is not included because it is only a graduate and professional school. So I appreciate Dr. Kobian in the last presentation mentioning that involvement in Filipino-American student life is complicated. And that's really a lot of what my study focuses on. So here's a glimpse of Filipino-American student life at UCI. There are 8 Filipino-American student groups at UCI, if you count the Alumni Association, dating back to Kababayan, which is the broadly stated Filipino-American cultural organization, which was founded in 1974, 9 years after UCI was founded. Kababayan has about 300 to 400 members. It's the largest club at UCI, and very likely one of the largest, if not the largest, Filipino-American student organization in the United States. Other organizations that have come along include PUSO for pre-health students, Liwanag, which is the Filipino Catholic community, Fusion, which began as an engineering club and is sort of more of a STEM club now, PAASE for Filipino students in social studies, Filipino-Americans in medicine, FAME is focused solely on medical students, MD students, and then Cairo Omicron or Expo, which is the Filipino-American fraternity, and the Filipino-American alumni chapter has been resurrected in 2020. It previously had existed, but has faded away and now come back again. I call this slide the pull because these student groups really do create a sense of belonging, as many of the past presenters, all of them, have mentioned, that students feel pulled to these organizations. They talk about how, you know, oh, my kuya or my ate is in this organization, that's why I joined. These are my family. They talk a lot about how these organizations really give them a sense of belonging on campus, right? That they just feel drawn to them almost instinctively, something in their soul just draws them to participate in these clubs and give so much of their time and energy to these clubs and the causes that they, you know, that they put forth on the campus community. And the subjects of this study, in particular, the subset that I'm focusing on are 8 students who are board members of Kababayan, so who have executive board positions in the Filipino-American Cultural Club on campus. So again, this is not surprising, again, based on what the other presenters have said, that these students refer to the ways that they're drawn into these organizations. But what I really found in interviewing these students is that there is an unnamed push, push out of other spaces on campus that they can't necessarily name or critique. But so one quote that really exemplifies that is this student who said, when people say UCI, they say University of Chinese Immigrants. This is sort of a, I guess, to some derogatory, to some empowering colloquialism about UCI, which has been prevalent in the state of California amongst high school students for decades, right? This person says, people don't talk about Filipinos here. They think Filipinos are dancers, singers, or party a lot. We haven't really made a name for ourselves. So again, despite the fact that there are 2,000 Filipino students and they have such a large quantifiable presence in you know, the size of their organization and the number of students, they still feel that no one can really talk about Filipino students on their campus, or they still have to explain to students what Filipinos are. And I think this is also more specifically talked about through a student who is in Kababayan, but is also in PUSO, the pre-health club. And I asked this student, what's so Filipino about being in PUSO? And they said, well, it's the people in it. There's Filipinos in this club, but they're basically describing that other than that, there's not a lot of Filipino cultural elements to being in PUSO, the Filipino pre-health student organization. But what I found particularly poignant is that this student said, if we would just be a normal pre-health club if they weren't Filipino. So instinctively, you see here that this student contrasts being Filipino with being normal. And that says a lot about how they perceive their identity on campus, that it's not normal, that it is somehow outside of what is you know, typical to this campus culture, despite the fact that they are so omnipresent. And they understand this, right? When I ask these students, who again are prominent Filipino-American community members, so they're used to having these talking points in their back pocket, I asked them, how many Filipino students do you think are on this campus? And most of them get it right. Most of them say around 2,000, which is correct, right? So it's not like they don't understand the scope of what it means or how many Filipinos are on campus, but yet they still feel like they are outsiders. And when I ask them about the things that they do on campus as part of these Filipino clubs, we really see this sort of relative sense of privilege and representation. Again, they are the largest club on campus, period. They are bigger than any fraternity. They are bigger than any academic society, any philanthropic society, what have you. But they still don't see themselves as leaders in the community. They still don't see themselves as people who belong on campus, right? So for example, when I ask about the interactions in the cross-cultural center, between other student of color organizations, this student who I've quoted here understands that Asian American organizations have this power in numbers, but yet still doesn't quite see fit for Asian American clubs, in particular Kababayan, to become leaders. They describe this sense of crisis management amongst student of color organizations. That's the only time they really come together, when there's some crisis to handle, right? And through that, we see that, as the other presenters have mentioned, that Filipino-American students and Asian American students more broadly, right, have no sense of mentorship to be able to capitalize on the relative privileges that they have, right? That, they still don't, if they don't see themselves as belonging to this university community, they don't see themselves as the ones who should be taking on that responsibility to organize politically like they have in the past, or to advocate for the needs of minority students or students of color. Now, again, as I mentioned, we've talked, or other panelists have talked about the UC system in this aggregate, but when we specifically focus on UCI as sort of, I guess to say, disaggregating that institution, there's definitely a lack of academic belonging at UCI. UCI does not, despite its prominence, especially recently in national rankings and prestige, UCI does not have the same social or cultural capital that UCLA or UC Berkeley has. Actually all of my respondents said it was not my first choice to go to UCI. I wanted to go to UCLA, but not everyone can get into UCLA. And again, this is a very old sense of thinking, to be quite frank. This is really the thinking of a generation ago, when UCLA and UC Berkeley had such a wide gap at the head of the pack in the UC system. But nowadays, the data and the rankings tell us that UCI is right up there on par with UCLA and UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC San Diego. For the last 2 years, UCI has had the most in-state applications from California entering freshmen. So UCI is, despite the fact that UCI has the most Filipino students in the UC system and is quickly gaining national acclaim as a research institution, the specter of UCLA and UC Berkeley still floats over them, and students at UCI tend to think that this is their second choice, so they have no sense of academic belonging there. The next quote I'm going to highlight is from a Filipino-American, Asian American studies professor who has actually since left the university. But when she talks about her relationship with Filipino-American student leaders, she says that they don't really take her class on Filipino-American experience, but they've asked for these student-led courses in Tagalog. And that really speaks to the disconnect between the representation at an institutional level and what students are really looking for from the institution. They want Tagalog, and in this particular case, she illustrates that they want Tagalog in an informal setting. So they don't even want Tagalog to go on their transcript. They just want it to occur at the university in some form, in a very low stakes fashion. And you can interpret that in many ways, right? You could interpret that as many students say, I can't fit it in my schedule. I'm this major or that major. There's no time to take Tagalog or any Filipino-American studies class. Again, speaking to the Filipino-American amnesia that was mentioned earlier, I mean, I'm sure that some of these students don't even see Filipino-American studies as academically rigorous or worthwhile. And again, this speaks to the invisible labor that these few and far between Filipino-American faculty or staff members undertake. This professor is being asked to teach a Tagalog class when she has no formal training in Tagalog? How many of you who are Tagalog speakers and have, these very accomplished academic credentials in other fields, how many of you really think you could sit down with a group of 10 or 15 students and teach them how to speak Tagalog from scratch, right? But this is what is expected of these students. This is how they interact with the academic enterprise at UCI, right? This is how they see their Filipino-ness fitting into that. So those are a few, just snapshots of where Filipino-Americans see themselves academically or culturally within this institution where they are so well represented. So what that implies for higher education are multiple things. First, there are varying dimensions of belonging and thriving. Just because there are so many Filipino students that have these student groups that do great things and give students a sense of belonging, doesn't mean that they feel belonging to the institution per se. So for example, Kababayan's the Filipino club, and many students will say, or alums, for example, will say, I'm an alum of Kababayan. I am not an alumnus of UCI. I have no affiliation with UCI. I strictly have an affiliation with the Filipino-American community. So you see there that there's a difference between belonging and thriving. I also want to mention, in terms of a qualitative study, that keep in mind, I am interviewing students who think about their Filipino-American identity on a weekly, if not daily basis. These are Filipino-American student leaders. These are the people who get called when something bad goes down on campus regarding Filipino students. These are the people who are constantly thinking about putting on Filipino-American student programming. And even then, even these students who are up to their elbows in Filipino-American content still think that their university does not do enough because it doesn't bring enough to the institutional level in the ways that they want. Another thing that is important to keep in mind when we think about whether or not Filipino-American students are an underrepresented minority group or how to serve them are relevant laws and policies. California has passed Proposition 209, which prevents the consideration of race and ethnicity, in matters of public contracting, which includes higher education. So there are definitely ways that the UC system encourages us to work around those definitions, right? So for example, by saying, instead of saying we're doing outreach to Filipino students, you can say we're doing outreach to students in Carson, California. And you know that you're doing outreach to a wide swath of students, but you know that you'll still capture a lot of Filipino Americans if you concentrate on the enclave in that way. Another thing is, for example, our first presentation mentioned SAT scores, but moving forward, the University of California will no longer consider SAT scores for freshman admission. So considering the impact that may have on Filipino-American students is vital to serving them appropriately. The scope and mission of your institution, again, the University of California is able to disaggregate Asian American ethnic data because that represents the population of their state. But you might also think about, as was mentioned previously, 40% of Filipino Americans live in the state of California. So when we think about how to serve Filipino students, do national numbers serve us well? Or is it more appropriate to think about what is within the scope of the institution? And just real quick to wrap up, I often encourage in the work that I do to tell people to think about diversity in relation to minds and not just bodies. So it's not enough to put a person of race or ethnicity X into a position of influence. It's also about what is that person's academic training? How is that person able to actually connect to students? Amongst diversity workers in higher education, the past generation of folks, are people who learned about diversity work through webinars like this. But now we have a new generation of academic professionals, faculty, and staff who are able to engage with this in their academic training. So thinking about how to serve students really requires a re-examination of how we evaluate the institutions that are meant to serve them. And lastly, I'll just mention, academic outreach. It's not enough, and it hasn't been enough for a long time to simply have this, if we build it, they will come mentality. Institutions must do active outreach to students to really make sure that they are being represented in ways that are reflective of their needs and their desires. and things change very quickly outside of the institution, but they're not as quick to change within the institution. So I think the student voices in particular should always be considered, in terms of implementing any outreach or program or policy that affects these students. So I will stop there, and thank you all very much for your time, and I'll open the floor up to our question and answer section.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xavier Hernandez, for providing clarity to the concept of invisibility or institutional invisibility through your data from the ground. So, and thank you to our previous speakers, Dr. Demata and Dr. Kobian. Now we are ready for our first Q&A. We have like at least 3 or 4 questions, but I'd like to address the first question, whether this session is recorded, whether they can share it, and whether they can watch it again. Yes, this session is on YouTube. And so therefore, you can just go there anytime after this session and watch the recording.